Welcome, Stream Team. This is Bitstream coming to you today. And I wanted to talk to everybody just a little bit about the tax cuts that were just passed and how that affects cryptocurrency in general, and also just my general thoughts on cryptocurrency as a whole and its future, and how it all kind of fits together. And I wanted to take it back to, a few basic concepts that I think we need to understand when we're evaluating what to do with our cryptocurrency, Bitcoin in the future and everything, and just tie a couple of things together and connect some dots. There's a thing called an inflation tax, and it's not something that we generally think about because overall inflation is slow, right? It's not very fast. It's noticeable, but it's not like, oh my God, I can't, do anything because I'm stuck, right? Inflation is like 2 or 3% per year, except in times of like a recession or something like that. Then it slows down or even reverses. But for the most part, on average, it's about 2% per year, right? So I guess I should talk about, when the government issues tax cuts, like what's going on right now, we have major tax cuts, right? So what that means for the government is that the government is going to be taking in less money, less revenue. The government cut its own salary in essence, right? So what has to happen in conjunction for that, for things to balance out, is the government has to spend less money by cutting programs or, have less outflows going out. So if the government does not cut enough or take enough off the table so that it balances out the lower amount of revenue coming in to pay for stuff, then how does stuff get paid for? Well, the government issues debt, or they print money to pay for the stuff that the taxes would have otherwise paid for. So what did we just learn? When new money is created or printed, that means that more money is going to come into the system, which makes everything cost more of those dollars because there's more dollars out there. So what that in essence is, when inflation is a result of government action, then it's essentially a tax. So because the government is choosing to issue more money because it takes in less revenue and doesn't want to cut the programs, or can't cut the programs and spending that it's doing enough to make up for it, then they still have to pay for what needs to be paid for. And they do that through inflation by issuing debt. So what happens with that debt is it's a tax, because even though you're not writing a check to the government to pay it, you're still paying it because of the government action. So if my gallon of milk goes from $2 to $3, no, I didn't write that check to the government, not directly, but it's because of the government that my milk went up, and it's a dollar is a dollar, right? So whether I'm writing that check to the government or writing that check to the grocery store, it's still increased because of the same action. The government doesn't have the option to not pay for certain things. Like, it's law that it has to pay for certain things. Like, you can't just default on the national debt, for example. It's by law, it has to be paid. I believe it's by law, so I have to check on that. So don't take me as I believe it has to be paid. But it's going to pay, because, and even if it's not law, if the United States government didn't pay its debt, I mean, that would be a crash of biblical proportions. I can't even go into that. Look that up on your own, but it would be bad. So the government has to pay its bills, right? So what happens is when you have those type of tax cuts come in, and as a result of inflation, it really acts as a regressive tax hike. And what a regressive and progressive tax is, in the United States, we have a progressive tax system when it comes to income tax, which means the more income that you make, the higher rate of tax that you pay on the higher brackets of income. So, for example, everything above whatever the number is, like $100,000 in income or something like that, every dollar above the 100,000, you're gonna be paying like 35%. Every dollar between 50 and 100, you'll be paying 25%, and lower and lower and lower. So that's called a progressive tax system. But the inflation tax is inherently regressive, which means that the people that make the less, that have the less income or the less money, least amount of money, pay in proportion to their income more of the tax. So while wealthy people, the wealthier people may pay more in a total amount, if we go back to the gallon of milk example, gallon of milk costs everybody the same thing. So it doesn't care how rich or poor you are. A gallon of milk is a gallon of milk. Same thing with everything, any kind of good or service for the most part, right? So paying $3 for a gallon of milk when I only make $3 an hour is a much higher percentage of my income than if I make $300 an hour. It hurts me way, way less. So as a proportion of income, I have just paid my inflation tax at a much higher rate than a wealthy person. So in effect, it's a tax hike on the poor. It's a tax hike on everybody, but proportionately, it's a regressive tax that disadvantages poorer people versus more wealthy people. Okay. So also, this is why the national debt is so high, because what is a politician going to do if they don't have anything else to offer? They're going to offer tax cuts, right? It's the easiest thing to offer. Tax cuts. I'm going to cut your taxes, run campaigns on it. And what are you going to do? You're going to vote for them because you don't want to pay taxes. It's the easiest and laziest thing in history to get you elected. You don't really have to do anything. I'm going to put more money in your pocket, whatever, promise this and that. And as a result, all politicians use it as a crutch to get elected, and then they have to get in there and keep their promise. So what do? Cut taxes. Every time you cut taxes and you don't cut the programs to go along with it, which would also could be a disaster, because you got programs such as the military, you got programs such as the nuclear program, you got NASA, you got all of those things that we rely on the government to do. So you can't just cut programs, whenever you want to. You got Social Security and all of this stuff. You don't cut programs to match the decrease in revenue, like I said earlier. Then you add to the deficit, which then goes towards adding towards the debt. As the deficit increases, and that's the deficit between money in and money out from government spending, then you have to borrow to pay it. When you borrow to pay it, it increases debt. To pay the debt, you have to print more money. When you print more money, you cause inflation. It's a domino effect, right? So tax cuts, in effect, are a way to shift the financial burden of funding the government from the more wealthy to the less wealthy. That's, in effect, what it does, because the bills are going to get paid. The government is going to pay its bills. The money has to come from somewhere. You can't just cut taxes and then that's it. There is no free lunch. So you may be thinking, why is that a bad thing, right? Why not shift the burden of running the government to poor people? Well, when you do that, poor people have less income or less disposable income to spend on goods and services. So if a poor person spends all of their money on a gallon of milk, then they can't go out and buy a PlayStation. or they then can't go out and buy shoes for their kids or whatever. You know what I'm saying? They have to make decisions on where the money goes, and those decisions get tougher and tougher as the dollars get squeezed. And it reverts to more and more basic needs, which means that the companies that service the less basic needs start to take in less revenue. And as they take in less revenue, they go out of business. They start to go out of business, or their stock price falls, or, whatever. And as prices of the markets fall and the companies do worse, so does the economy go. And that's how you start to get recessions. Okay. So when you shift the burden onto the poor or the less well off in an economy, and have more of the gross domestic product going towards the more wealthy, then you're asking for a recession. And that's not just me talking, it's happened twice since I've been alive. You've got the Reagan tax era, the tax cuts for the Reagan era, and you got the Bush tax cuts. Both times you led to boom bust cycles. You had a small temporary boom in the markets and then a recession. Both times. Okay. So that's what happens when you have things like this happen. And it's happening again because most people can't connect the dots between tax cut, inflation, and all of this stuff, and what it leads to. And they don't want to, for the most part. They wouldn't even think to, because I get to pay less taxes, and people hate taxes and they hate the government, and they don't want to fund the massive big brother government and all this kind of stuff. But they don't really think about or even know what the consequences of that are. They just know tax cuts, So that's my thoughts on that.